Okay, I think we'll make a start if that's okay, and then if people want to come in and join us, they're very welcome. I'll just wait for here we go. So welcome to the breakout session on Actions for Nature, NPWS partnerships and initiatives. I'll just start by telling you who's up here on the stage. Some of you will have met me this morning. My name is Ciara Carberry. I'm the Director of Conservation Measures in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. As Niall O'Donoghue mentioned, and as the Minister mentioned, I'm one of 5 new directors of the National Parks and Wildlife Service who have been appointed. I'm actually the longest serving director now, having been in post since the end of July last year. So I think that might be a bit of a record in terms of a new team for NPWS. So I'm delighted to meet all of you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all as the session goes on. This is very much a session about partnership. And just maybe as an orientation at the very start, what I would like us to get to at the end of the session, if we can, is something that's useful for the National Biodiversity Action Plan in terms of recommendations. So can we put our collective brains to work together and maybe come up with 2 or 3 really compelling actions that can go into the plan? So sitting beside me here on the stage, we have 3 key speakers who are going to, I suppose, after my own presentation, which will be about the general nuts and bolts of getting things done. How do we actually get this done? What does it look like? And a little bit about conservation measures. We will have John Carey, who is going to talk to us about the LIFE programme, NPWS partnerships, and of course the Corncrake. And I believe there will be some acoustic accompaniment, which should be very nice. We have Sue Callaghan of the NPWS from the Neffin Forest Conversion Project. And we have Michael Davoren, who is a key speaker here and who brings the perspective of someone who participated from the other side in one of our projects in the Burren, and whom I have heard speak before, and who made such a compelling case for the need for partnership that I think it will be very inspiring. No pressure, Michael, to hear from you today. So we'll start with me and the least pretty and the least picturesque presentation, I'm sure. So have a look at this. There's a legend in the corner that gives it away. But if you have a look at the map, it's a very simple representation of Natura sites in Ireland. The blue ones are SPA sites, protected for birds. The red ones are special areas of conservation. The directorate that I head up in the NPWS was established partly in response to legal proceedings against Ireland in the form of what we call colloquially the measures case. So some of you will be very familiar with that. And that's a legal case around the requirement to implement conservation measures at special areas of conservation. But everything that applies in that case and all of the requirements to look after special areas of conservation, by and large, translate across into special protection areas as well. So this map is interesting just in terms of location. These are all over the place. I'm going to concentrate mainly today on SACs in my part of the presentation. This is just a pinpoint map of where the middle of the site is. Have a look at this one, which is the boundaries. And what's very, very noticeable to me in looking at this one, you can see some of them are rivers, you can see them down the bottom, but there's a huge concentration of these sites over to the west of the country when you take account of the areas of the sites. So that's something, when we're taking a very practical and a very real look at how we're going to manage them, we need to bear in mind that they're not evenly distributed all over the place. And I suppose the burden of looking after them then isn't evenly distributed either. So in total, there are 604 Natura sites in Ireland. Now, sometimes there's debate on the margins of that figure. Maybe some of them should be, maybe there should be more, maybe there should be less. So just coming at this from a legal point of view, there are 604 illegally at the moment. We can increase the numbers. It's very difficult to de-designate them after you've designated them, but currently there are 604. 439 of those are special areas of conservation and the rest are SPAs. So this is one, and this is just to give you an idea of what a special area of conservation looks like. This is a relatively small site. It only has one qualifying interest. And what I'd like you to look at, if you wouldn't mind, is the boundary of the site and how we set the boundary. We get a lot of questions around site boundaries and can you not move the boundary and why is the end of my field in and my neighbour's field not, and so on. So if you look at the boundary, you can see that what's inside the boundary, even at this very zoomed out mapping level, is completely different to what's outside, and that the boundary has very carefully traced around to avoid things that at the date when the site was designated were not suitable for designation. So we don't take account of things that happened after designation. So if you manage somehow to destroy a part of the site, well, then you have to put it back. But something that was a car park, for example, at the date of designation of the site, we shouldn't be designating that. We generally are very careful not to. No process is perfect, of course, and sometimes we have to go back and have another look. And as part of the legal process of designation, there is an opportunity for landowners in the area to come back and go, look, you've designated the end of my driveway for transition mire, and actually it's been driveway since 1964, and then we would go back and look at the aerial maps and see whether it really was a driveway. We could look back over the records. So we don't take things out because they're not suitable for designation now, but we will sometimes adjust the boundaries as we go through the process for something that never should have been in there in the first place. So if you want to find out about a designated site, all the information about them is on the website. So I'm just going to click through here and you can see what I mean. So that site I just showed you is Hugginstown Fen. That's where it is. You can see, can you see my pointer? You can, great. Qualifying interests. So the Habitats Directive requires you to designate the boundaries of a site with legal certainty. There's a statutory instrument at the end of that process to list the qualifying interests for the site. So in other words, what are the things about that site that make it suitable for designation on the European stage? So you're not talking about sites here that are significant nationally or locally or regionally. You're talking about sites that are important enough to be significant at a European level. So Hugginstown Fen, which is the one we were just looking at, there's the site code. It's in Kilkenny. These are the coordinates. And the qualifying interests, there's a single one here for alkaline fen. So when we're managing that site or looking at how it's managed, that's what we're managing it for. If you want to find out more detailed information about the site, the statutory instrument actually designating the site is on the same page. So if you click in here, this one was designated by Minister Heather Humphreys at the time. Lots of information in it. One of the things that's in the statutory instrument is it's associated with a map, and the map is the legally binding map for the site. The qualifying interests for the site are in it. There's the map. And very importantly, there's a list in the statutory instrument of activities at the site which require the consent of the minister before they can be carried out. They're all listed in there. So my point really is that this isn't a matter of opinion and whose opinion it is that you should or shouldn't be allowed to do these things. These things are legally binding. If you want to find out about a site, you can look them up on the website. They're all published right there. What's special about that site and what kind of activities require consent. That's all published information. Here's another one. Does anyone recognize that one? Any brave people like to guess? Malahide, very good, very good. Malahide Estuary, okay. And again, that illustrates, do you see that we took the bridge out? So the red line very, very carefully and precisely circumscribes the bit there that shouldn't be in. It goes up the beach, but not onto the developed land here. So the boundaries are done with really quite a bit of precision, and the proposed boundaries are circulated out for people to comment on them, and particularly if your land is being affected, you have an opportunity to object on scientific grounds. You can't object on the ground that you wanted to build an amusement park on it or something. We won't entertain that, but if you wanted to object on the basis that what we said was there as a qualifying interest isn't there at all and never was, then that will be carefully considered. And we have an independent board that consider those if you're not happy with our review. So Malahide, estuary, just clicking through very quickly. Qualifying interests, you see there are more of them there. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 qualifying interests at Malahide Estuary SAC. And again, you can look at the statutory instrument and you can get all the information there, perfectly legally sound and up to date. So 4 things you have to do under the Habitats Directive, just coming right back to basics. The first one is designate your sites with legal certainty, including where the boundary is, what the qualifying interests are. The second one is that we're obliged to identify site-specific conservation objectives for the site, having regard to the threats and pressures that are operating on the qualifying interests at the site. So at the moment, we have site-specific conservation objectives published for, I think, about 360-something sites. There are more generic objectives published for the others, but what we're doing is we're working on really, really detailed site-specific conservation objectives that are tied very closely to the threats and pressures at the site. All of those are published on the website as well. You can look them up for each site and see what they are. They set the objectives for the site. The third thing that we're required to do is identify actions that will deliver on those objectives. So you know where the site is, you know what's special about it, you know what the threats and pressures are that you're trying to deal with, then you have to identify actions to deliver on your objectives for the site. Those actions to deliver on the objectives are measures. So the meaning of conservation measures is quite precise in that sense. They are the actions that you're going to deliver to meet the conservation objectives that deal with the threats and pressures on the site. And then the final requirement there, of course, is it's not enough to just identify the actions, you actually have to do the actions. So as we've gone around designing a measures programme, these are just some of the challenges that have come up, and they'll be very familiar to anyone here who's worked on protected sites. Our maps are all moving onto a more modern map base. Some of the old maps were drawn by hand. We've got much better mapping technology. They're being made more accurate all the time. A lot of our sites are in private ownership in Ireland. That's not the case in every other country. So we have to work then in partnership with the owners of the site. A lot of the sites have multiple owners. Some of our sites, some of the big sites, would have thousands and thousands of landowners at the site. Some of our traditional programme approaches are designed to deal with a particular habitat type or a particular species type, but not tied to sites at all. So those programmes are wonderful and they're delivering many, many objectives for a particular habitat type, many objectives for a particular species type. But historically, nobody has been actually looking at the site and going, well, you know, there are 5 habitats and species that this site we're supposed to be looking after. Looking after one of them isn't going to cut it. We have to look after all of them. So part of the conservation measures programme and part of the challenge is to move to a more site-based consideration so that we get a complete set of measures in place for a site. A complete set of measures means that you have a measure there that covers all the qualifying interests and all the threats and pressures at the site. Okay. We have all kinds of strange incentives operating at sites. Some of them are driving people to behave in a way that supports the conservation of the site, but there's absolutely no doubt that Ireland as a state sometimes is providing incentives to people to behave in a way that is counter to the objectives for the site. So we have an issue there to try and bring consistency to that so that in general people are decent enough. In general people want to look after sites, but not if we're going to provide massive incentives to behave in the opposite direction. Sanctions and enforcement I've put down the bottom because I have some background in the justice sector before I came over here, and really I know that there's a great temptation to call for prosecutions, and sometimes those are absolutely necessary. But what I will say to you is that if you get to the point where you have to use the coercive power of the state against somebody, 9 times out of 10 you failed somewhere along the way to communicate effectively with that person, or to run a public awareness program so that people understand, or to deliver on your own side of the bargain. So really using coercive measures, using prosecution most of the time, really that should be your measure of last resort, and it should never be the first thing you move to. Okay, so what are measures? Measures can be 3 things, and often when we think about measures, we think about physical work like blocking a drain or putting up a deer fence or removing rhododendron from a site. All of those are measures indeed if they address the objectives for the site, but measures are much broader than that, and this is something that for those of you who are involved in these sites I'd like you to think about. The first group of measures are legal or statutory measures, and there's some overlap between these. But the type of thing I showed you earlier where you have the activities requiring the consent of the minister, that is a statutory or regulatory measure to protect the site. If you want to carry out those activities, you have to get the minister's permission to do it. That's a regulatory measure. The planning legislation is a regulatory measure. There are all kinds of laws in Ireland and regulations around water protection, around all kinds of environmental protections, and they're all examples of measures when applied at the specific site. The second type are contractual measures. So contractual measures are measures where there's an agreement or a contract, and especially where that contract is enforceable, so that if the other person breaks it, you can, say, take them to court maybe, or there's a penalty for breaking the contract. So an example of that would be, an example of a contractual measure is an agreement, say a memorandum of understanding between 2 parties to manage a site, where that's binding, that's a contractual measure. Also, you can have contractual measures around financial incentives and grant schemes, where you bring a site into a grant scheme, you bring a site into a program, and there's an agreement there with the landowners. Those are measures. And then the last group are administrative measures, which are things done under administrative powers, which mean that you don't need a special law to do it, and you didn't need a contract to do it. You just went out and replaced a sluice gate or blocked a drain, or under your normal powers, you're managing populations of different species at the site or whatnot. So I'll fly through these. I think I've mentioned most of them already. Legal measures, if you behave a certain way at a site, the state can prosecute you, that's a legal measure. Or the ability to hold the state to account via judicial review is a legal measure in the opposite direction. We have loads of legislation which I won't go through: agriculture legislation, water legislation, marine legislation, and so on. Contractual measures, subsidies, grants, programs, management plans, all agreements. And then administrative powers, this is a broad one: practical works and interventions, licensing and permits. There's a bit of an overlap there with the regulatory measures one, so some of the boundaries are blurry. Education programs, education and awareness programs about sites, provided that they're tied to the site and they apply at the site, are an example of measures. Grant schemes, inspection regimes, say if you are issued with a license and you breach its terms and the state can revoke the license, that's also a measure. And then procurement conditions. So if we say we will only allow you to build in the national park if you meet certain conservation requirements for your practices and for the way you carry out your work, that's also a measure, that type of a requirement. So they're broader than we think they are. As I said earlier, 13%, I think, of Ireland is designated for this purpose at the moment. That figure, I suspect, is going to rise. We're going to see marine designations in particular coming down the tracks, and there are all kinds of plans afoot, as we heard from speakers today. So much of our territory is in private ownership. The only way forward is partnership, and the speakers who are here with me today are going to talk to you about specific examples of partnerships. But here are some of the people that we cannot design our plans without taking them into account. Community actors and members of the public, sections of the public, whose action or inaction has a huge impact on the site. Key state actors whose action or inaction has a huge impact on a site. And then key civil society groups and actors, NGOs, community groups, whose actions have a very significant effect at a site. So when we're making decisions about sites, this is an acronym that's used mainly in medical decision making actually, but I think it's a very useful one to bear in mind, and it's called BRAIN, and it's one that we use a little bit in my section, and I am spreading it around the place. The first one is when we're considering an action that we consider the benefits. What are the benefits of doing this? The second one is what are the risks? And we're quite good at doing that already. The third one, what are the alternatives? What else could we do? Is there another way of coming at this? The fourth one is what are the implications? So if we do this, what happens down the line? We're not great at doing that at the moment. What are the implications and have we built them in before we make the decision, not find out about them halfway through? And then the last one, what happens if we do nothing? There are some sites and qualifying interests where actually they're stable, they're okay, and what we need to be doing is keeping a watchful eye on them and not necessarily intervening. These are some of the people, I won't go through them all, but they are some of the people that we need to be thinking about when we're designing interventions at sites. You have people who use the site locally as an amenity site. We need to engage with them. You could have NGOs operating or community groups that are really committed to looking after the site, and we need to talk to them. We need to talk to landowners, particularly landowners who are farmers, and I think Michael will speak to that perspective a little bit in a moment. You have local people whose economic interests are tied up with the site, or companies who are operating near the site and affecting it. You have rangers from the NPWS, and there's going to be more and more of those, I'm very pleased to say, who are trying to manage the site locally. You have local elected representatives and national elected representatives, and then you have landowners who might be part in and part out of the site. If we really, really want to deliver a conservation measures programme and really look after our Natura sites, there is a pathway to doing that. It's a well-worn and a well-known pathway to delivering a major, major intervention. And it is this: you need to create a sense of the need to manage the sites in the wider population among all those people I spoke about there. The second thing you need to do is you need to provide leadership to people in an authoritative way, in a way that is respected, and in a way that people, and I don't mean people you know and people who already like listening to you, I mean broadly, that people will listen to what you say, that your voice is respected. So we need to provide leadership. The leadership on biodiversity is going to come from this group at this conference. So a trusted voice, a trusted leadership. And that leadership has a couple of different things to do. One thing you need to be able to do, or we need to be able to do, is to paint a picture for people of what does the world look like when we get there. Because if people look at the biodiversity action plan, the biodiversity strategy, and if they can't actually picture a world that works for them when we arrive on the other side, they'll do one of two things. One is they won't engage at all and they'll decide to sit back and see what happens and watch how other people get on. Or the other thing is they will be actively invested in staying the same because they're nervous, because they don't know what the territory looks like on the other side. So that's one thing we need to do as a leadership group and a challenge. How do we paint the picture for people of what the world looks like on the other side? The other thing we need to do is we need to convince people that we know how to get from here to the other side, so that we have strategies and ways that will actually work of getting them from the world as it is today to the other side of the problem. And we need to communicate very, very well about that. There are a few other follow-up things. We need to have a look, are there serious obstacles operating to getting us to this place where we want to go? We need to take them out of the picture where we can. But on the flip side of that, where people are delivering interventions that are working, where people are providing leadership, where people are leading on excellent projects and being models of excellence, we need to reward that behaviour. And we need to recognise and provide recognition for people for excellence in the field. My last comment is, how will we know when we get there? And that's a thing for discussion, and I think all of what I've said is a thing for discussion today. But I suggest to you that we will know we've got there when looking after nature and looking after biodiversity is just the way we do things in Ireland. It's just what we do. We all do it, everybody does it, it becomes normal. It's not unusual in any way. It's just the way that we behave here. And that's when we know that we've successfully embedded what we need to do into our culture and into our society. So I shall hand over to John Carey, who is going to talk in much more concrete terms about actions that can be delivered and what he's doing as part of the LIFE project. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Good day, Martha. It's Mr. John Carey, agus Tommy on Bannister, Chunskadal, Corncrake, no Trainic Life. It's lovely to be here today to see real people in the flesh. Thanks, Ciara, for your talk, and I'm going to talk specifically now about the LIFE programme and in particular the Corncrake LIFE project, which I'm very honoured to manage. Just a show of hands, who has actually heard a corncrake in real life? Oh, that's good news. Well, this is one of my favourite photographs of a corncrake. I took it about 2 weeks ago. So, can anyone spot it? No. And that's good. That means we're doing our job well. Because corncrakes really should be heard and not seen. But for those of you not familiar with corncrakes, that is the sound of a calling male corncrake. In fact, that is the calling male corncrake in that photograph. And that is a singular sound in nature, and it is a sound that 60 years ago would have been heard in almost every single townland in Ireland. And it's been lost. And it's been lost because the landscape that supports that particular species of bird has been lost. Corncrakes are a fascinating bird. They arrive home to Ireland every year, usually in early to mid-April. And what we kind of know about corncrakes now, although not definitively, is that Irish corncrakes, unlike their European counterparts, actually overwinter in West Africa, not in Southeast Africa, not in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia. So back in 2011, the RSPB put a number of radio tags on Scottish birds. What they found is that the birds actually migrated down into the Ivory Coast and Ghana, and then undertook a secondary migration west into the Congo, and had this unusual relationship with Congolese elephants, which keep forest glades open so that the birds and lots of other species actually benefit from those open areas. So there is a relationship between corncrakes from Donegal and Congolese elephants, which still doesn't make sense to me in my head. When the birds arrive back to Ireland, that is when they are home. This is their home. This is where they're born, and this is where they return to. And this is where the problems actually start. Because this fantastic graphic illustrates the life cycle of the corncrake when it arrives back here to Ireland. And it is a small bird, not much bigger than a blackbird. And it nests on the ground. And the corncrakes are very short-lived. They only live for 2 or 3 years in the wild. So their life strategy is to inundate the place with more corncrakes. And each female is seeking to be replaced by at least one other breeding female to keep the population at least stable. And she does this by having 2 clutches of chicks. She has a clutch of chicks now, actually. They've just hatched in early June. They're very, very independent chicks, and after 10 days, they're on their own. And she lays a second clutch of eggs. And this is a grassland species of bird. So you can imagine the changes in agricultural practices in Ireland in the last 50 or 60 years if you're a grassland bird that nests on the ground. And humans and corncrakes have always gone together. It was a form of commensalism, really, where the birds benefited from the type of agriculture that was prevalent in Ireland in the 50s and 60s. Hay was cut late in the season for winter fodder, often cut by hand. Things have shifted on monumentally since then. We estimate that in the late 1960s, there was about 5,000 calling male corncrakes in Ireland. You see, we count the calling males because this is a very secretive bird. They don't like to be seen. They don't like their nests to be found. But you've heard the call. He's quite conspicuous, so he's easy enough to count. But we have much better figures from about the late 1970s onwards. And what we can see here is a dramatic decline in the species population. And in that 50-year period that I've highlighted there, the population loss has been almost 90%. And the range contraction has been almost 95%. Corncrakes have effectively been wiped out from the Irish countryside. And they can now only be found in coastal areas. What's really important to note on this map, which shows the current distribution of the birds, is that these areas are on the absolute fringe of Ireland. And the communities and the farmers and the landowners in these high nature value areas are about as far from the centre of power as you can get. They are right out there on the edge. And yet, they have some of the most important assets when it comes to biodiversity that this country has. To deal with the situation around corncrake conservation, given it's an annexed species, given that there are 10 sites in Ireland designated for it, we need to deliver conservation measures to try and protect the corncrake. To the point that one of our sites designated for corncrake, the Middle Shannon Callows SPA, has lost its population of corncrakes since 2015, and they are not coming back. So the remaining 9 sites, we need action on them. As part of the process of delivering that action, the NPWS applied for funding to the EU LIFE programme in 2018. The EU LIFE programme is a whale of money sitting there to be tapped into. And Ireland has only recently begun tapping into that resource. And yet, Michael here, who will talk about the Burren programme, when we have undertaken LIFE projects in the past, Ireland has been remarkably successful. The Burren programme is still talked about, the Burren LIFE project, across Europe as a massive success. So Ireland has great pedigree here, and I'm delighted to see that there are at least 4 LIFE projects now in partnership with the NPWS. And partnerships are very important in all of this, because we're not here on our own. Our project team is effectively managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service as the lead beneficiary. But we have 4 other partners, and they're crucial to the success of what our project is trying to achieve. The Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Fota Wildlife Park, ATU, formerly GMIT, and Údarás na Gaeltachta. And Údarás are extremely important because the overlap between the distribution of the corncrakes and the Irish language is about 90%. The project comes with specific component objectives. We're looking at securing landowner cooperation and local community involvement, and that really is the thing I'd like to focus on here in terms of partnerships. We also need to deliver measures on the ground as ecologists and conservation, undertaking measures that improve habitat situation for the birds, things like creating the early and late cover that they need when they first arrive back, improving management regimes on sites, and improving knowledge exchange with landowners. And sitting on top of all that is to try and create new perspectives. Because I can tell you here and now, folks, land designation has legacy issues. Not everyone was delighted when a letter came in the post to say your land is now designated for a corncrake or a hen harrier or any other species, as particularly in the west and northwest of Ireland. Because like I've said, these communities are about as far from the centre of power as you can get. They feel talked down to. And that has huge legacy issues for us to try and deliver conservation measures on the ground. We know what we need to do for corncrakes. We call it early, middle, late. We need people and landowners and farmers to create early cover for the birds. We need contractors to cut their meadows from the middle out to give the birds a sporting chance to escape the moor. We need people to cut their meadows later in the season to give that second clutch of birds an opportunity to make it to adulthood. It's quite simple when you distill it down. But how do we seriously make this happen? How do we make it happen with communities and farmers who feel disenfranchised, who don't want to talk to you? The reality of it is that in any of these projects, what you inherit from it is a corporate system of community engagement. Have a project launch, do a pamphlet drop, have a focus group in the local town hall. Can I tell you something seriously? If I'd held a focus group in the local town hall in West Donegal, it would have been like that opening scene in The Mission. I would have been strapped to a cross and thrown up a waterfall. No one would have talked to us. So instead, we engaged in active engagement. We knocked on doors. We did a lot of listening. We took a lot of abuse. But we got through it because people suddenly started feeling listened to. They suddenly started to feel that this project is trying to be part of our community, not a part of our community. We wanted to bring people with us. We didn't want to impose on them. What we actually did was we started to build connections. We identified who are our key stakeholders: farmers, landowners, agricultural contractors, advisors, and local community. And then we said, who's on the opposite end of our connections? National Parks and Wildlife Service, the designators, the redcoats they're called in some places, Department of Agriculture, local development companies, policymakers, the wider public. And the project had to become a bridge between all of these key stakeholders. The next thing we needed to do was communicate. And I can tell you, when you put these stakeholders together and try and get people talking, there are a lot of conversations that genuinely don't involve you. Conversations that are not for the Corncrake Life project, but at least you can ignite them and get them going. So for us, our communication goes through a filter. We put everything through the filter of the corncrake. This bird's life cycle is paramount to us. We need it to successfully breed. Everything in terms of our communication goes through that filter. And then we start to collaborate. And we collaborate with the wider public, such as here with seed collection, where the wider public collects seeds and we bring it to schools to plant it. We bring it to the farmers themselves to put it out on their fields. We collaborate with agricultural contractors to improve conservation measures in the fields, such as wildlife-friendly mowing and the development of flushing bars. And of course, we collaborate with our partners, with the Department of Agriculture, to develop agricultural schemes, with Photo Wildlife Park on breeding, with research with ATU, and with Údarás na Gaeltachta on local development opportunities. And then we co-facilitate. We sit down with the farmers who are now becoming leaders themselves. Those conversations, those difficult conversations have been had. Leaders have emerged. Conversations are now flowing. But you need a vehicle to do that. And the vehicle to co-facilitate with farmers is through results-based agri-environmental payment schemes, which they have co-designed, which they feel that they have inputted into, not that have been imposed on them, but something that is flexible and adaptable to their needs. And then we continue. And we go back to this slide that I opened with, where some people would have viewed that as waste ground on their farm. They now suddenly view that as one of the most valuable assets on their farm. So just in conclusion, we're 18 months into our project. We've got another 3.5 years left. We've got 47 pilot farmers in our scheme. I was told at the beginning you could be lucky to get one. We have 20 private landowners in management agreements. They're a very important group of people. There are people who own land who do not farm. That land is designated. That land has a biodiversity asset attached to it. We've over 400 hectares in active management. We've created 5 to 7 hectares of early and late cover. I can't put an accurate figure on it because every time we visit the farm, the farmer has created more. And we've seen a 15% increase in the bird numbers since 2018. Something is moving in the right direction. Hopefully it's the LIFE project. And finally, positivity. For the first time in a long time, farmers and landowners actually feel listened to. They feel there's someone they can talk to and communicate with. Garmila Maigov, you'll find out more about the project here, and I'll answer any questions later. Cheers.
Thank you very much, John. I think you did exactly what I mentioned earlier in painting a picture of what it can look like when we get something right. There's something very haunting and almost romantic around the Corncrake story, and those big echoes of hope at the end of it resonate so very, very strongly. Thank you. Thanks a million. Sue, Callaghan is going to talk to us now about a different project and a different type of partnership. So we will try and leave as much time as we can at the end for engagement. I know we started a little late, but we do hope to still fit in some questions. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Ciara. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sue Callaghan. I'm working within National Parks and Wildlife Service for about 20 years. And in the current role as Neff and Forest Project Manager for the past few months. I suppose what I thought I'd do today was firstly give you an idea. We're based in Wild Neff National Parks in County Mayo in the northwest. The habitat there is primarily peatland habitat, extensive peatland habitat. This is just a map here showing you, I suppose, the main body of the national park is 11,000 hectares. And what I want to focus my talk on today is the Neff and Forest Conversion Project, which is focusing on the conversion of 4,000 or 5,000 hectares of what was commercial forestry plantation. So these lands have now been subsumed into the main body of the national park. But if you look at it, you can see some of the main towns in the area. It's quite, I suppose, sparsely populated area. There's Newport Town there to the south, Mulranny, and in the far west is Ballycroy, and that's where the National Park Visitor Centre is located. But you can see there, it's like a satellite section of land. It's a 40-hectare site, but it is separated quite significantly from the National Park. And the National Park, the main body of it is through the Neffin Mountains, be upland habitat and lowland blanket bog. And you can see a spot, sorry, I don't have a pointer, but the spotted line through it is the Bangor Trail. And then to the far right and the far side of the mountains then is the Neffin Forest, this large commercial forestry plantation, which is a different colour. So that's just kind of a context of where it is. And it's important this is the visitor centre. Again, in context, you can see the distance between it and the main part of the national park in the distance, which is separated. And for a visitor, and at the time, a few years ago, I was working as the District Conservation Officer, and I had responsibility with respect to the rangers and the education facilities there. And it was very difficult for us in terms of trying to manage it as a national park, because we had responsibilities not only for nature conservation, which was the driving issue, but also with respect to recreation, cultural and protecting our cultural heritage, spiritual heritage, and trying to facilitate access for people into the park. So the visitor would arrive and ask for this five-hour hike that they'd be looking for, which you'd naturally expect when you come to a visitor centre, and we weren't able to provide that. So this was a serious conundrum and difficulty for us in NPWS in terms of national park management. And like all the other national parks, well, unlike all the other national parks, they all have this kind of honeypot almost. You know, Glendalough would have the Glendalough Valley, or the Wicklow Mountains would have the Glendalough Valley, whereas we didn't have that. So it was quite a difficult nettle, pardon the pun, to grasp in terms of park management. But from the visitor centre site, we developed the visitor centre and we set up this education programme, which has been an incredible success, an incredibly important part of our role as within NPWS. And also, as a 40-hectare site, we decided we'd focus, I suppose it's not designated, these lands, so we had a bit of freedom in terms of what we could do there. And so what we did was focus on looking at little small habitat types and developing them. We removed grazers from the site, so there's been natural succession there, and in terms of what you call, I suppose, rewilding, it's a peatland habitat, and it's going from heath now to there's rowan and birch developing there as well. We've done some tree planting, a linnet plot, meadow management, pond and wetland creation. So these are just some examples of that. What has become our honeypot is the Dark Sky Park accreditation, which has been massive. And this is where the whole stakeholder engagement idea is and I'll speed through this because it's not a part of my talk, but it's important because it was the community that drove this Dark Sky Park accreditation. It was a student from GMIT who approached me about it, and that's where it developed from, and there was huge amount of community engagement with respect to it. And there is a group, Friends of Mayo Dark Sky group, where we continue to engage with the local community with respect to it. So it's very important, and it's key in my mind now in my new role. There's also the Callaghan Mountain Coastal Trail, which is just south of it, 2-hectare site, and that's been an iconic site now in terms of dark sky development, but it was also an iconic site for park infrastructure. We developed this boardwalk at a time when there was no money in NPWS. Budgets were completely gone, pretty much, and we engaged with the rural social scheme and with volunteers, and we built this 3-kilometre boardwalk on an extreme budget. So there are examples, and then the Bangor Trail, again, dealing and engaging with the local community and working with the rural social scheme and local farmers working on the Bangor Trail work. So we're trying to grasp with opportunities, I suppose, for that honeypot, that hook for the national park, but we were still finding difficulties, and people were moving toward Letterkeene, which is in the south part of the site, southeast, but it's nowhere near Ballycroy National Park Visitor Centre. It's nowhere near it. It's a 40-minute drive. So this is where the Nephin Wilderness Project stemmed from, and those lands were owned by Quilcha. So we developed, I suppose, a partnership with them to try and develop this 4,000-hectare site, which was commercially not viable for them. So Quilcha were looking for other opportunities with respect to these lands. So an MOU agreement was set up between ourselves and Quilcha, and there was initial consultation with those communities through local clinics. And the project was certainly received with great fanfare. There was a wilderness conference, and it captured people's imagination, this concept of wilderness. And a 15-year draft conversion plan was written. There was a technical group set up that I was part of, and we pulled together this draft conversion plan, but it never really continued. We achieved wilderness accreditation, but I think this is one of the stakeholder groups, there was a lot of differing opinion, which was important, and we were all coming in with different hats on and different things that were different motivations for us all, whether it be tourism or conservation or education. They were all different things that were driving us. Sorry, I'll fly through this now. But progress was slowed, certainly by a number of issues, consensus on the management of this. The wilderness accreditation has a non-intervention zone, which was focused around the national park and the blanket bog areas, but that was at odds with our recreational strategy and trying to provide some sort of infrastructure to facilitate access to the park. So there were issues also with respect to invasive species, notably rhododendron, and the fact that the main body of it was a commercial forestry plantation. So a certain amount of intervention and management, active management, was going to happen. So our focus, as you can see here, this is all the designated lands, and the initial wilderness area was within the designated lands. And these are heathlands, which are pretty much secondary habitats. If you were to allow them to become a so-called wilderness where all grazers were excluded, it would become scrub. So it would be at odds with Habitats Directive. And as NPWS, we wanted to turn our focus really to the commercial forestry plantation area. And what could we do with it? How could we restore this habitat? This is where we need to put our energy. This is where we need to put our imagination and our creativity and ultimately our money and focus. So the photograph to the left there is this site in 1974. It was completely, it was all blanket bog. And now you can see this is an example of it. The background picture, it's all forested now. So this area was forested in between 50s and 70s. It's got 3 salmonid catchments, 3 really important river catchments within it. So again, there's water quality issues, so the importance for us to focus our moving away from the wilderness and concept and focusing in on this concept of rewilding, or simply, but I suppose, ecological restoration. And from these areas, again, there's different water quality. So there's high, good, moderate, and poor water quality coming from the rivers from this site. So these are important focuses for us. And this is to get an idea of the extent of the area. It's massive. So I've just started in this role. Sorry, I'm going to fly through this now. Sorry. In 2018, we took on the management ourselves, NPWS. So we have now taken over those Quilcha lands and subsumed it into the national park, as I said. So the idea is that the focus is entirely now on conservation management. But up to that, our funding streams were driven by other things, from Fáilte Ireland, from Mayo County Council, and their focus was on this Wild Mayo brand. So funding was coming with respect to tourism initiatives. But nature conservation was still there for us and for our staff. And this is, again, a time when NPWS is poorly funded, poorly staffed. And it was our staff and the vision of people within NPWS that has driven a lot of the work that's happened, the conservation work that's happened so far. And that primarily has been tree planting. So our achievements to date has been commercial. The forestry operations have ceased. There's been planting of 5,000 native trees by ourselves, just independently, and also Quilcha. Then there are other sites that have been cleared, and through engagement with ourselves, the Forest Service, and Quilcha, they've now replanted with native trees rather than the Sitka spruce or the Norway pine, lodgepole pine, sorry. So there's been thinning trials of the lodgepole pine. You can see at the bottom there, creation of grazing exclosures. We've got grazing issues with respect to sheep and also deer, introduced deer. There's been development of trails, fire safety codes, restoration of stone cottages, rhodo control, and then monitoring studies. So we've had great engagement with the Marine Institute in the past 2 years, which has really been positive engagement. The amount of baseline data that they have for this area is since the 1960s for the Burshul catchment. So they've been monitoring and surveying salmonids and water quality all through this time. So the amount of data that we have there is spectacular. And we have at the moment a PhD student, Colin Guilfoyle, who's surveying that 4,000 hectares, 200 quadrat sites, and doing putting together the baseline data for that. So before we undertake any proper management work, we have a baseline survey done, which is invaluable. There they are. And this is one of the sites that would have been clearfelled by Quilcha. It's along the Altacony River. And we then worked with them, asked them, right, let's replant now with native trees and also native Scots pine, which is from the Burren site. But initially, and also people keep asking, well, where's the plan, where's the plan, where's the plan? So that's my role now. I'm writing the specific plan now for the Neffen Forest conversion, and we'll be going to we still have our technical working group, so engaging with them and then engaging with the public. So in 2021, the wilderness plan has been reviewed, and the focus has changed now to rewilding and habitat restoration. Project manager, which is my role, was appointed in 2021, and I've taken over the role there in March. So my role again, complete the draft, facilitate public and statutory consultation. So hopefully that'll be through SEA. So there will be formal statutory consultation and appropriate assessment, engaging with communities, secure funding, developing collaborative links. Sorry now, I'm way out of time. So these are all the things that we'd like to do in the future. We haven't done them yet, but maybe next year or in 5 years when I come back, I'll be able to tick a few of these boxes. And also, I think it's important to point out the response that people have to NEFN. This was an art project that we had, and we had creative submissions from all sorts of all members of the public. And I thought this was a particularly beautiful one from one lady, and just about the piece and the experience that she had in the NEFN area and within the national park. Sean Lycett, a book, has also been inspired by the area Wild NEFN, which is a beautiful book of poetry and prose and history. And then also there's 3 or 4 important archaeological sites there, so we have to ensure that that cultural heritage is protected, and ultimately then for future generations. Many thanks. Apologies now, I had to speed through that.
Many thanks, Sue. I think if the measure of a good presentation is that it left you wanting to hear a little bit more, I think that certainly hit that mark. And I hope that we will be able to hear more about the project at a future date. Today is, I suppose, a taste of lots of different things, and hopefully the start of more engagement on all of these things. I'm going to call on Michael Davoren now, who's going to bring a very different perspective yet again on what it's like to partner in one of these arrangements and what we can learn from the approach that was taken in the project Michael was involved in. Thank you, Michael.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is indeed great to be here in Dublin Castle as a farmer presenting to a biodiversity project. 540 million years ago, life began on Earth. And in the intervening years, there has been 5 major natural events which has pushed biodiversity to the edge of the extinction. But each time it came back better and stronger than ever. This time round, it's very different. We, humans, have caused the problem. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to try and help nature to fix the problem. So the question we ask ourselves is, what do we do and how do we do it? Well, we can take wisdom from the old proverb, if we want to change the world globally, we act locally. And that's what happened 25 years ago down in the Burren, when we were thrown into disarray by the implication of SSEs being imposed upon us. Of course, they were imposed upon us because of actions that happened in the EU 2 decades before, with its quest to fill the void of 30% deficient in food. We were all educated and financed by both Europe and national governments to be much more efficient and industrious in the way we produced our food, and we were. And by the 90s, we'd gone into overproduction. And that's how SSEs were implemented, because it was noted by the EU that biodiversity was being affected big time. For us, the farmers of the Burren, it hit us like a ton of brick. We were legislated into special areas of conservation. The conditions that were imposed by academics and environmentalists were to solve other problems caused further north in the mineral size from overgrazing. They didn't suit us in the Burren because we outwintered cattle. But we weren't consulted. It was imposed top down. They knew better, and many thought the Burren would be a better place if there was no farm there at all. The place was frozen in time. We tried to fight back, but the law was there and we had to obey it. Lucky for us, there was an agricultural consultant from the Burren who told us we'd never be listened to until we got academia on our side. And so he got his PhD student to do his PhD on the impact of farming on the natural heritage of the Burren. That student was Brendan Dunford. When Brendan arrived in the Burren, it changed everything. He was the first academic that ever listened to us as farmers. He went round the Burren from house to house, listened to us moan, extracted the bits of information that he required, researched them. And when his PhD was published, it proved that the only way to manage the Burren was to continue to farm it like it had been done for thousands of years. Now the academics and environmentalists sat up and listened. One of their own had told them this. They had to listen. We had a moral victory. But we couldn't do this on our own. So we had to go back to our old adversaries. And despite the bitter rows that we've had with them, we sat down with them and the Department of Agriculture and together looked for life funding to come up with solutions to the questions asked in the PhD. We got that funding. Brendan quickly put a team together and challenged us, the farmers, to come up with the answers. How the Burren could best be managed. Quickly, trackways were put into remote areas of farm. Scrub that was encroaching was being cut and treated. A special ration was created to feed the cow so that she could deliver a healthy calf, because much of our income comes from the production of the raw material for the suckler or for the beef industry. This was all wonderful, but the key to it all was the scoring system, which has been referred to today by many other speakers. That scoring system was double-edged. Number one, it proved the environmental integrity of each field in the Burren. But it doubled up as a scoring system. The higher the score, the more money I earned as a farmer, and every other farmer likewise. If I got a score of 6, I got €70 a hectare. If I got a score of 10, I got €170 a hectare. There was a massive incentive for me as a farmer to get my environmental integrity of every field up to where it should be. And this is how the farmers of the Burren came round and want to be part of such an environmental project. The project is based on 5 basic principles which can be implemented anywhere. The first question is, what has changed in the last 70 years since Minister Noonan was fishing and playing in the woods in Kilkenny? The second question, how has this affected us? Why has it changed? The third question is, using modern day technology, how can we create the ancient farming systems so that the environment can rejuvenate itself? The fourth, put the proper infrastructure in place to advise and instruct the farmer, just like what was done with the Burren Life team in the Burren, so that the advice can be got, that farmers know clearly what it is needs to be achieved. And 50, put the money in place and fund and convince the farmers to join the scheme. This is how we manage our special areas of conservation. But what do we do with our intensive farming at the other end of the spectrum? How does biodiversity work out there? Well, the Burren Bio Trust, which is the only environmental charity in Ireland, has already begun that work. Through the education programme in the schools, every school in the Burren gets a 6-week programme so that every child in the Burren since 2008 has grown up and has graduated as a Burren expert in their local schools and has a pride of place and a knowledge of why it's important. They also have place-based education for us adults through the walks and talks and webinars, through the Hare's Corner, and this is especially important to other farm areas in County Clare. This began last year, where 30 ponds were put in place and 40 mini archers and 50 mini woodlands, in waste pieces of grounds, sometimes in very intense farms. This all helps biodiversity. The argument about how food is produced is an argument for another day, not for today. Today is about how we produce biodiverse outcomes from farming. But while that's fine for intensive farming and SAC land, the vast majority of Ireland, of the farmland, is extensively farmed with very low margins. And 80% of farmers in Ireland at the minute, of the 120,000 farms, are part-time. They can't make a living from farming in the modern day era. They need support. I think there's a massive opportunity for both national parks and wildlife and agriculture to come together and use the templates that we have to convince all of those areas. And it's a vast task. But you need to come together and convince farmers, find out, work with them, find out why is their area gone into decline, what was there in the past that kept and supported biodiversity. But don't forget the third party in this holy trinity, the farmer. They own the land. They have the knowledge. They want to do the right thing. It is up to you people to put the proper structures in place to deliver the right thing. Back to that old proverb, if we want to change the world globally by acting locally, this is what we have to do. Now we know how to do it. Let's go ahead and do it together. Ní neart go cóir le céile. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's a very compelling perspective that you bring, and it's grounded in reality and experience, which is powerful. We have a few minutes left, I think, not as many minutes as we'd like, for questions. Coming back to what I said at the very beginning, one of the things we're tasked with is sort of forming themes and trying to come up with a few things that might be useful in terms of recommendations for the National Biodiversity Action Plan. But I think we might start with a couple of questions from the floor, and then Rebecca here in front is the rapporteur for this session, and she's also keeping an eye, I think, on whether we have questions online that are coming in. But we'll start with the people who are actually in the room, and I think at some point we'll get the rap on the door and we'll be told to finish up. But if anyone has a question or a comment they'd like to make, you're very welcome. We have a roving mic there at the back for you, or if everyone is in a chicken curry coma from the lunch, that's okay too. Thank you. I think we have a question here. If you wouldn't mind saying who you are and what organisation you're here from, please.
Hi, Christina Ravitch from KRA. I was very interested in the presentation about Wild Neffin and the mention of the rewilding and basically removal of grazers. My own personal point of view, and I've no skin in the game, is that, sheep grazing has reduced most of our uplands, the UK's uplands, New Zealand's uplands, to deserts. And I'd be very interested, it was the first mention at this conference of that concept. I'd be very interested to hear the panel discuss that a little more.
Thank you. Sue, would you like to come in on that one?
Yeah. I suppose with respect to the Wild Neffin project, so initially it was a wilderness project, and it was focusing on that idea of wilderness, and that wasn't really something that we felt that we could achieve. So we wanted to focus then on the coniferous plantation and how we could restore it to something that was an ecologically robust habitat. So when I say rewilding, it's in terms of bringing back the hydrological function of that site so that it can function. I suppose rewilding is about bringing back those natural processes so that it is a self-contained, ecologically robust habitat. And it doesn't mean excluding grazers entirely, although this is a serious issue, certainly, particularly with our uplands and in some areas in peatland habitats. But that particular project, we're not focusing on that element of it. The main focus at the moment is the ecological, I suppose, robustness of the site. In general then, in general terms, well, we're looking at say, for instance, the visitor centre site. So it is very interesting there where you do exclude grazers. And there has been a complete change in the habitat quality. And the habitat type, it is moving now to a scrub type site where you're moving from heather heath now to scrub. So, I mean, if you wanted to rewild the uplands in the national park, the only way to do that, because if you think about the map that we showed, it's very interspersed. You've fragmented and almost islands of sites. You can't fence it. That's not a sustainable solution. You also have to consider the fact that sheep farming is an integral part of the community there, and by putting a fence and excluding animals entirely, you're also going to create, I suppose, separation between it and the local community, and that's not going to work. And that's been what our focus is on. So sustainable grazing is really important, and that's what we want to work towards and move towards. How that's done is important then in terms of agricultural policy as well as environmental policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Would either of the other speakers like to come in?
Thanks be to God, you don't get corncrakes in the uplands.
Okay. All right. So it just brings me back a little bit to the whole benefits and risks, alternatives, implications, and then weighing up the cost of doing nothing, making active decisions about something like grazing with good information is what we need to be doing, I suppose, and sort of blunt instruments and one size fits all don't work well in ecological systems generally. Are there any other contributions? Okay, my friend here. If you wouldn't mind, let us know who you are and whether you're here from an organisation. Thank you.
Maeve O'Reilly from Gas Networks Ireland. I have a question maybe for Michael and Ciara. You raised a really wonderful example of how the schools in your area have now got the Burren project as part of their syllabus, and it seems to have been added to the syllabus there already. It's already been done, so I'm just wondering, has that been put into the National Biodiversity Action Plan, or is this something that's being considered nationally, that local biodiversity initiatives might become part of local school curriculums?
Did you want to come in, Michael, on that one?
Yes, that's a great idea. It would be wonderful if it was, but the Trust do a voluntary teaching course in each school in the Burren. It's yet not part of the curriculum, but they do also do training course for teachers in the Burren. For the teachers in the Burren, of course, but for teachers all over the country if they wish to come to it at the end of the year. So that's a start. But we'd love to see place-based learning improved all over the country.
I think there's probably the answer to this one is like the answer to so many other things. There are examples of gold star, fantastic practice everywhere. Maybe one of the actions for the plan when it comes out is to draw those together and have a proper strategy for delivering that on a more even basis throughout the country. I mean, we are tasked with coming up with actions from this group if we can. So if we think that's an action, I think we'll rapporteur it and put it forward. There's no doubt that public engagement and awareness is hugely important. It's usually important for a whole load of different reasons. And one of the changes to the National Parks and Wildlife Service is that there will be a directorate specifically tasked with engagement and awareness and a new head of comms, precisely because we recognise the importance of that issue.
Just in terms of teaching and education, I think it's important that certainly that teachers are trained up. I think teacher training is a key, because I've just found in my own experience with education, environmental education, teachers tend to be afraid to bring children out into the natural world, because there has been a kind of a disengagement almost. So I think training and empowering teachers themselves to deliver environmental education is very important, rather than it leaving to NPWS or specific other little programs. So if, as you said, if it can be part of the curriculum itself and teachers themselves can deliver that, then it's very important.
I think we'll take one more question if we'll get away with it before we have to wrap up. Is there anybody with a final comment or a question or anything they think would be very important as a takeaway? Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Ciara Hamilton here from Woodstown Wildlife. Just echoing the points excellently made there earlier about education of the children and how that would be so beneficial to be rolled out. I think we're missing the demographic of the adults and educating those. It looks like when you have a special area of conservation, you have a targeted attempt to discuss with the people most impacted. But for existing habitats that we have, and we have a chance for to protect, and adults are the people who need to protect it. I think we were assuming that the children are going to grow up and fix their problems, and at the moment we're the ones with the kind of lawnmowers, and we're the people who are demanding public parks are kept a particular way. And just as regards actions for the plan going forward, I think we need to do a lot more on educating kind of our own demographic outside of here on how to engage with nature and value what we have. And I think maybe if we leave that up to the NGOs to do, those NGOs are kind of thin on the ground and working hard and committed to certain projects. There'll be huge areas that we'll miss that need protection at the moment. So just wondering if we think that is something that we need to look more into.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point, because at the moment, at this point in time, maybe we are the generation with the economic power. We are the generation in control here. So we could do a lot of damage in the meantime while waiting for the young people to come up through. So that is something I think we should be acutely aware of. I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious of the wrap-up plenary should have started 2 minutes ago, and we've run slightly over. I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to this session, our three speakers who made such compelling contributions, and everyone who contributed with your questions. I wish we'd had time for more, but it's been a pleasure speaking to you and hearing from you, and thank you very much for coming this afternoon.